He certainly has leverage that he can use, but at the same time, from his standpoint, if he goes with a deal, the deal would have to entail sanctions relief. It would be good for the United States because he would be able to say that he got a deal better than Obama's on the nuclear issue, for instance. And it would be good for the United States to finally be able to say, okay, this conflict with Iran has now been either resolved or some sort of a semi-solution has been achieved through negotiations.
Mm-hmm.
But he will then also face another problem if he goes with a deal, which is the Israelis are mad enough about the fact that the US has stopped bombing Iran. But it's a completely different thing if Trump then also strikes a deal with Iran and lifts sanctions. The Israelis have opposed every deal that the US has contemplated with Iran that entailed sanctions relief. Part of the reason for that is, of course, that what war achieved for the Israelis was to set back Iran several decades, bomb them back to the Stone Age, as they said, destroy their industrial base. That is achieved through warfare, but it is also achieved over a longer period of time through sanctions that slowly but surely degrades the country's industrial base. Iran in oil fields are not producing as much oil as they could because they have been deprived of the investment and new technology that is needed to keep those oil fields up to par. So over time, it is degrading Iran. But if the United States then lifts the sanctions, and on top of that strikes a deal with Iran and no longer is at war, Iran would essentially be unleashed. This is the nightmare scenario for the Israelis. So their resistance against the deal is going to be massive. And the question is, will Trump take that fight with the Israelis, or will he say, you know what, I got out of the war. It's just easier for me to walk away. I won't go back into the war, but I also won't make a deal and lift sanctions. And that way I avoid that bigger fight with the Israelis. And this is just politically easier for me to do. So he can go in that direction. It will not be an ideal situation for him, but he will still have achieved his main objective, get out of the war, whereas the Iranians will have been deprived of their main goal, which is to get the sanctions lifted.
Now, obviously, what looms over much of this is the JCPOA. The previous Obama deal has been referenced a lot because those heavily critical of Trump essentially emphasized that he's going to come up with something very similar to that, if not even worse or watered down, at least from a US perspective, and his interests over enrichment and the Iranians' interests on that. So, what's your position on that? Is this effectively where we're going? Sort of a new deal of that kind, or is it going to be different?
I think it's going to be different. What was on the table in Geneva was very different in the sense that the Iranians would only be enriching for 2 reactors on a needs basis, which meant that for the next 5 to 7 years, they wouldn't be enriching at all. They would not be keeping any stockpile of enriched uranium on their own soil. Those are significant differences that would objectively make it a better deal from a US perspective than the JCPOA. So Trump already back then could have objectively said he got a better deal than Obama. He could have declared victory. Instead, he chose to declare war. And now that has backfired tremendously. What is fascinating is that in these negotiations that are taking place, the Iranians have actually not backtracked on the Geneva proposal. What I think they're doing instead, however, is that they're asking for a much higher price in terms of the sanctions relief that they're asking for in return. In fact, I think they're going for the whole gambit. Whereas the sanctions they were asking for in Geneva was far more limited in return. So the price, the deal is still on the table, the offer is still there, but the price has just gone up.